Chaerephon to the Delphic Oracle. By the way, folks, the Delphic Oracle was a big deal. It would be strange for an actual person who was not reverent towards the gods to have gone here. It was a shrine to the god Apollo. Apollo was the god of wisdom. He symbolically was the god, he was symbolized by the sun. You know, the story is he's the one who trots the sun around in its course in his chariot. You know the symbolism behind the mythology. But anyway, he went to the shrine of Apollo. Most of us would call this a religious act called pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is a big deal for those who have studied religion. If it has its effect, it's supposed to do what? Yeah, an outer journey leads to an inner transformation. So for a person who didn't give a rip about spirituality and so forth, going on a pilgrimage would be a rather odd thing. I'm just laying that out there as commentary. But anyway, when the priestess at this shrine ends up speaking the words of the gods, you've probably seen movie versions of the priestesses getting into trances and so forth. But when she spoke the word of the god, Socrates is wisest among them. Now for those, and this is just a little side note, how many of you saw this word in the textbook? How many of you saw the word irony? Good. Now irony refers to the fact that meaning for words and phrases sometimes is on more than one level. And sometimes the less obvious meaning is actually the more meaningful meaning, if you will. Now, Socrates also understood that men have a tendency to be highly arrogant. And the gods, sometimes in their wisdom, teach us lessons of sorts. He says, I know that I'm not wise. How can this be true? But remember, he's not going to blaspheme the gods, because to say that the gods were full of crap would have been blasphemy. So he says, the God speaks the truth. So this statement must be true. Maybe I have to figure out what it means. And in order to figure out what it means, he said that he had conversations looking for what kind of a person? A wise man. Thank you, yeah. Yeah. He sought a wise person. And he ended up having these conversations in the agora. He spoke to many people. And in apology, these three groups of people were specifically mentioned. He says, I spoke with artisans, politicians, and poets, hoping to find a person who was indeed wise. Now, why would Socrates have wanted to find a wise person? He knew he wasn't going to, by the way. You probably got that punchline. Why would a humble person want to find a wise person? And by the way, this is consistent with all of the world's great wisdom traditions. When you find a wise person, you humble yourself and say, please teach me. He wanted to find a wise person so he could be instructed by that wise person. He did not find a wise person. And he talked to these various groups of people who either professed to be wise themselves or other people esteemed them to be wise. He found not a wise person among them. And by the way, that's also an impudent thing to say at the trial. because some of the people who accused him were among the people who he had pissed off in this way. I found that none of them actually possessed wisdom. But they, and I want you to know this word, hint, hint, it will come up again. He found that many of them possessed different kinds of knowledge. But knowledge and wisdom are not the same thing. As a matter of fact, one of the words for knowledge that's specifically mentioned in the text is this. Maybe you saw the word techne. Good, good. It is where we get our word technology. Techne is the Greek word for the knowledge of how to do something. The ability to do something. And by the way, it typically meant something like knowledge of your craft. So, go ahead.
You say it could also mean technique.
Well, absolutely, because to have technical know-how is to be able to do something. Now you notice you might be able to do something well and not really understand it. What's the example that the author of our text gives? And you'll hear this again on Monday. Take the person who plays the piano well. It is quite possible to learn to play the piano by rote and to be able to do it beautifully. That is a knowledge of how to get to the right place on the keys and exactly when in order to play a song. It's possible to do that without being able to read what? Yeah, to actually read music. And there are people who can read music who don't have any knowledge of musical theory, do not have an understanding of harmonies and things of this nature. I tried and tried and tried to play various musical instruments, and for one reason or another, I blew royal chunks. Never got any good at it. Never got any good at reading music. Now, of course, someone like Socrates might say, if you tried to understand it on a richer, deeper level, those other things may have come. But there's many people who know it on this level, but who don't understand things like the big picture, if I can be cliche. When I speak of the big picture, I'm talking about wisdom. The cobbler knows very well how to make shoes and to craft them wonderfully. But that particular kind of knowledge is not wisdom. The politicians know their game of statecraft very well. Many of them know the sophist art inside and out and know how to win friends and influence people. That is a particular kind of skill, a particular kind of knowledge, but it's not wisdom. The poets. How many of you had to read like Greek tragedies and so forth, or even just Greek poetry? The tragedians had put tremendous thought into the human condition and things of that nature. It does not follow that they had wisdom. They have particular insights, but those things aren't the same as wisdom. Now, Socrates never actually says what wisdom is, except he does say that only one has wisdom. Whom? He makes the claim that only the God is truly wise. Now that's a peculiar thing for a guy to say who is flat out accused of being impious and an atheist. And it's also a strange thing for a guy out of ancient Greece to say. You know where I'm going with this, right?
Because it's monotheistic as opposed to whatever the other one.
Polytheistic. Yeah. He speaks of God more in the singular. Whereas the commonplace Greek view about the gods was that there was a pantheon of gods, the gods had our various human foibles, and they were almost always behaving badly in one way or another. This is one of the reasons why Plato puts this into Socrates' mouth in the Republic. He says that the myths about the gods ought to be censored. We shouldn't be teaching them to the children. Because the gods are supposed to be what? They're supposed to be awesome, figures to look up to. Do we really want our children to look up to the god Zeus, who quite frankly was a lech? Do we really want our children to look up the gods who are constantly fomenting war with one another, rather than dealing with one another civilly? This is why Socrates believed that the way we thought about the gods, was wrong. When I say we, I'm talking about at their time. I'll talk about us later, perhaps. But he says, yeah, only the God is wise. He does discover this, too. Perhaps I am wise in a sense. And just to put this on the board, we might call the kind of wisdom that Socrates has as something like negative wisdom. In other words, Socrates never claims that he's wise. What he says is, I must be wiser than they are, because unlike them, I know what?
I know nothing.
Yeah. He knows he's not wise. He knows in the grand scheme of things, any kind of knowledge or wisdom that I have is paltry. The wisdom that he has is mere human wisdom. The problem is these other people, they think themselves wise when they're not. True wisdom is actually knowing that you're not wise. And by the way, knowing that you're not wise is actually a powerful starting point. Because if you really want to seek, you first have to give up any pretensions about your own greatness. The fact that the idea that you've got total wisdom, total cover. Get that out of your mind right away. It's also kind of like the ideal starting point for that thing that we call the ideal starting point for the Socratic method. Remember, if you really want to seek after a profound philosophical question, don't presuppose that you've got the answers. Come in with intellectual humility. Otherwise, you won't be prepared to do the most important thing. Give me 30 seconds. Otherwise, you won't be prepared to do the most important thing when you enter into a conversation. Anyone guess what that is? Yeah, what?
You won't be prepared to admit that you're wrong.
Yeah, well that, I was going to say, and listen. You really won't be prepared to listen. And I'm willing to admit this. I'm not proud of it, but I think a little bit of honesty is typically a good thing. I have been in plenty of conversations where I know I'm not really listening to everything that the other person is saying. I am listening for when the person fouls up, so I can go straight for the jugular. That is not the pathway towards Socratic wisdom. Not only is it presupposing that this other person has nothing whatsoever to offer. It already presupposes that. But guess what? That person might actually have some perspective that might minimally be able to keep you honest. And by the way, by keep honest, I mean keep you intellectually honest. Because in fact, the people who you should be having conversations with are people with whom you on the surface, have vehement disagreements. I find it boring to listen to people who I agree with on everything all the time. As a matter of fact, I think we oftentimes don't listen to one another. We just nod our heads. You know, because we're fighting for the same team, I guess is the cliche. Mr. Toberman.
So, like, does that mean it's impossible for, like, a human to achieve knowledge? I mean, not knowledge, wisdom? Because, like, in order for us to become wise, we have to say that we're not wise.
Yeah, that's kind of the rub. That is the best we can do when it comes to wisdom. And to use the distinction the textbook makes, this isn't to say that Socrates isn't wise. This isn't to say that there are not wise people. But to keep in mind, it's this. The distinction is, it is merely human wisdom. And to go back to something I said week 1 that's kind of reiterated here, we are finite beings. To think that we're going to have all of the answers, to think that we could do more than just appreciate the sounds of the universe, to think that we could truly understand it, is already to think that we are more than we actually are. The best we can do is maybe have a glimpse of these higher things. And I'm trying to sound like Socrates and Plato on purpose. Socrates and Plato would say that the profoundest of things we can never truly and fully understand. We can get some inklings about them. We can talk about the most meaningful things in metaphor and with analogy. But we can never fully grasp them because they are too awesome. And by the way, if you are a religious person, this is probably how you think of divinity. Just to give you an analogy that fits here. Did I answer your question, I hope? Good. Now, on the charge of corrupting the youth, he says, I don't really believe I'm corrupting the youth. He says, everything I've done, not only do I believe I was doing what the gods were commanding of me, but he says, I actually believe that I was doing good by the youth of Athens. And by the way, if I am not doing good by the youth of Athens, it wasn't done intentionally. Now, how many of you saw this word? I won't spell everything out about it. But the author of our text explains that Socrates held a doctrine of human action that is called intellectualism. Intellectualism states that what we believe, and when I say what we truly believe, will always result in action on our part. Or to put it another way, we always act on our beliefs. And where do beliefs occur? Yeah, beliefs are mental events. Beliefs are in our mind. Now, what Socrates contends, he contends that all people Socrates articulates this viewpoint that every single person wills some good. It's just we have different beliefs about what the good is. And to give you that query from the textbook, according to this doctrine, even the person who does evil things isn't doing so in order to be evil. And by the way, if you ever meet a person who says, I can't wait to go out and do evil things, for them, evil is their version of good. Go ahead, Hunter.
When I was reading it, one example just came in my head. Like, homeless that are starving. They know it's bad to steal, but they do it. But they don't think it's good. They just need to do it to survive.
Yeah.
Would that be like?
That's a good challenge. Did you hear it? He says, let's say someone is homeless and they end up deciding to steal something so they don't go hungry. On some level, they know that stealing is wrong. Now, I'm going to add something to that. What they know is that stealing is against the law. The thing is, not everybody believes that things that are against the law are truly good. Now, suppose that you are a person like some of Socrates' sophistic opponents. Remember that what they believed was truly good for the individual was to get as much as you could for yourself. Now, if you happen to believe that the good is all about getting what you want, everybody else is basically chattel to you. Am I making myself clear? If you literally believe that you are the only thing in the universe that matters, you don't really believe it's wrong to harm other people if it does what? If it helps you. Now keep in mind, you might know that it's socially disapproved to harm other people, but in your mind you don't really believe that it's wrong. You just believe it's punishable. How's that distinction?
Yeah, that helps. When you said it, they just know it's a law. It's not. They don't think it's evil.
Yeah, and admittedly, it's a distinction that's very, very subtle.
Yeah.
So
Peters.
within the text in Republic, there's the exchange between Theo something and Socrates. It's a sophist and Socrates.
Yeah, there's a lot of conversations in it, but go ahead.
Well, it's the one that's in the text itself. Anyways, they're debating, and Socrates is bashing the sophist for being a relativist. But in this case that we're talking about, Socrates is kind of bringing forward a slightly relativist view. Like, was Socrates a relativist? Did he really not believe much?
No.
I'm confused.
You brought up another distinction. Our beliefs about what is good are relative, but the true good is not relative. For Socrates and Plato, our beliefs about what is good are relative to our perspectives. However, what is truly good is not relative. And take a guess what kind of people know what is truly good. Yeah, the wisest of people are the ones who can tell the difference, or at least are better at telling the difference. Now, a consequence of this viewpoint intellectualism is Socrates believes that all evil doing is basically not the product of an evil will. It's the product of this. Socrates believes that the biggest problem for the human condition is ignorance. And just to make a leap that the text doesn't make, this is why the Socratic method is so profound. The aim of the Socratic method is to expose ignorance and to point people towards closer to enlightened awareness about things. The problem with the human condition is ignorance. And by the way, to answer to Mr. Hunter's earlier question a little bit more, things really are not so easy. And I talk about this when I discuss Socrates sometimes, but also Plato, but I'll bring this up now. I am perfectly aware on one level that my viewpoints about certain things are not enlightened. But it does not make them all that easy to bust. I'll give you an example. I grew up in American society, so unsurprisingly, I have been trained to hold what kind of values about things that will make me happy. Yeah. In other words, I want people to respect me. I mean, I grew up on the other side. I mean, I wasn't poor per se, but I I guess poor white trash would be the, I don't mind saying this. Yeah, I mean, I had plastic shoes and hand-me-downs. I was made fun of for, not being as rich. And I felt bad, I felt vengeful, that kind of thing. I'm willing to admit that. And to some extent, my entire life has been what? I am unenlightened, let that affect my entire sense of who I am. And I know this. I know it's not healthy. I care about what people think about me. Would I be better off what? I'd be better off giving that less of a place in my hierarchy of values. I want people to think that I've made it, but not because making it really matters to me. It's basically like giving those people who put me down half the peace sign. That is perfectly unenlightened thought. I know that it's unenlightened thought. When I say, I know it's unenlightened thought. But Socrates would say, if you know it, why don't you change? Well, on some level, I must not what?
Want to.
Yeah. Well, I'd say I must not really know it. On some level, I must not really know it, according to this. I'm kind of aware of it. And I see that the way that I live my life in a lot of ways is not really conducive to my being happy. I also agree with Socrates on one level, that a life of material moderation is actually immeasurably better than what kind of life? A life of radical excess. Because I know what about people who have lives of radical material excess? Well, I think they're shallow people, but on some level I want to be like them. Isn't that sick? And I think it's mostly because society tells us we're supposed to look up to them. Because if they're richer, they must be of higher value.